Hey everyone, welcome back to the Deep Dive. And today we're going really deep, like really deep into the world of philosophy, looking at how computers are changing our ideas about, right and wrong.
Yeah, it's definitely a hot topic because as technology keeps advancing, we're giving more and more power to algorithm, AI, and all that, and that brings up some serious ethical questions.
Yeah, it's funny. I use computers for everything, but I've never really stopped to think about, the morality of it all. It's like we just assume they're neutral tools, but is that really the whole story?
That's such a good point. We often think of computers as just tools, but the fact that they're becoming more autonomous and complex really
Mm.
challenges our traditional ideas about responsibility. And thankfully, you've shared this great resource to help us understand this, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on computing and moral responsibility.
Okay, so before we get into how computers make things complicated, let's start with the basics. When we say moral responsibility, what do we actually mean? It's one of those things that everyone kind of gets, but can we define it?
Absolutely. At its core, moral responsibility is about who deserves praise or blame for actions and their consequences. Think about it this way. If you see someone drowning and jump in to save them, that's praiseworthy. But if you stand by and do nothing knowing you could help, that's blameworthy.
Okay, that makes sense. But how do philosophers, break down this idea of responsibility? What makes an action morally charged?
Well, philosophers usually look for three key conditions. First, there's the causal connection, the idea that you actually played a part in the outcome. You can't be blamed for something you had zero control over.
Right, like you're not responsible for the weather.
Exactly.
Right.
The second condition is knowledge of consequences. To be held responsible, you should have reasonably been able to foresee the potential harm your actions might cause.
So if you accidentally trip someone and they break their leg, you might be less blameworthy than if you intentionally push them, because in the first scenario, you couldn't have predicted the outcome.
Precisely now, the third condition is freedom to act, meaning you had a genuine choice in the matter. You weren't coerced or forced if someone holds a gun to your head and makes you steal a car. You're not truly responsible for the theft.
Okay, those conditions make sense. So how do computers throw a wrench into these neat and tidy categories?
Well, let's start with that causal connection idea. With software, especially large, complex systems, it's often really tough to pinpoint who's responsible for what. Think about a self-driving car that causes an accident. Is it the fault of the programmers, the sensors, the AI, or even the driver who was supposed to be paying attention?
Yeah, that's a good point. There are so many layers involved in even seemingly simple computer systems. It's like a recipe gone wrong. Who do you blame? The person who wrote the recipe, the person who bought the ingredients, or the person who actually baked the cake?
It really is. And it's not just a hypothetical problem. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy brings up real-world examples like the Therac 25 radiation therapy machine. Due to software errors, it tragically overdosed patients. But who is responsible? The programmers, the hospital administrators who bought it, the technicians who used it. It became this tangled web of blame.
And I imagine this distance that computers create makes things even trickier.
Right.
A programmer could write a line of code today that has unforeseen consequences years later, halfway around the world. How can you be responsible for something that's so far removed from your actions in time and space?
That's another excellent point that distance in time and space is one of the key ways computing makes moral responsibility so slippery. The essay uses the term opacity to describe how most of us don't understand the inner workings of algorithms. We're kind of forced to trust them blindly, like the crew of the USS Vincennes, who relied on their Aegis system, which tragically led to the downing of an Iranian passenger plane.
And then on the flip side, sometimes people distrust computers too much. The SE talks about the Therac 25 operators who ignored the error messages, thinking they were just glitches so computers can make it hard to assess risk, and that impacts our judgment.
You've hit on a crucial issue. Computers don't just impact actions, they impact how we think and assess situations, which further muddies the waters of responsibility.
So we've established that computers can really complicate the whole, who's responsible thing when it comes to moral responsibility.
Mm.
But what about computers themselves? Can they be held morally accountable for their actions? It sounds kind of sci-fi, but with AI getting smarter all the time, it feels like we need to seriously consider it.
It's a question that's been debated for decades, and the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy really digs into the arguments. Some philosophers argue that as AI becomes more sophisticated and seemingly autonomous, we might start to see it as having a kind of moral agency.
Wait, hold on. Are we talking about computers having a sense of right and wrong,
Right.
like they're making conscious choices based on ethical considerations?
Well, it's not quite that simple. Even defining moral agency is a whole philosophical debate in itself, but think of it like this. We hold children to a different moral standard than adults, right? And we might even hold our pets accountable for bad behavior, like chewing up the furniture.
Okay, so we have different levels of moral responsibility depending on the agent's capacity for understanding and choice. But can a computer ever really grasp the meaning of its actions in the same way a human or even a dog can?
That's the core of the debate. Critics argue that computers lack true understanding emotions and the capacity to suffer, which makes punishment meaningless. They're just tools reflecting the values of their creators.
So even if a computer seems to be making its own choices, it's all based on the parameters set by humans. So there's chess-playing computers, they can beat grandmasters, but they don't actually understand the game in the same way a human does.
That's a great analogy. It highlights the difference between mimicking intelligence and actually possessing it. And the Concy talks about how the concept of intentionality is key here. A computer's actions might seem intentional, but those intentions ultimately stem from the humans who designed and programmed it.
Right. So the responsibility ultimately traces back to the humans in the loop, even if it's not always clear who those humans are. This whole discussion is making my head spin. But before we get too lost in the theoretical weeds, can we bring it back down to earth a bit? What are some practical ways we can address these challenges?
That's a fantastic question, and the SE does offer some real-world solutions. One idea they highlight is the need for a culture of accountability within the tech industry.
So it's not just about blaming individuals when things go wrong, but about creating a culture where people are encouraged to think about the ethical implications of their work from the very beginning.
Exactly. It's about integrating ethical considerations into the design process itself rather than just slapping on a Band-Aid after something goes wrong.
I can see how that would be a huge shift, especially in an industry that's often driven by speed and innovation. But how do you actually implement something like that?
Well, it involves things like promoting ethical training for programmers, establishing clear guidelines for responsible AI development, and encouraging more transparency about how algorithms work.
Transparency is a good point. It's hard to hold anyone accountable if we don't even understand what's happening under the hood. But even with the best intentions, sometimes things do go wrong. How can we ensure meaningful human oversight, even as AI gets more complex and powerful?
The SE suggests two key conditions for meaningful human control: tracking and tracing.
Okay, break those down for me. What do those terms actually mean in practice?
Tracking means making sure that the technology's actions align with human reasons and values. It's about ensuring that the AI is serving our goals, not the other way around.
So it's about keeping humans in the driver's seat, even as we're giving AI more and more control.
Exactly, and tracing is about being able to identify who's responsible for any given action taken by the system. It's about establishing clear lines of accountability even in complex systems where responsibility can easily get blurred.
That makes sense. If we can't trace back a decision to a human being, then it becomes almost impossible to hold anyone responsible. But isn't that going to get harder and harder as AI becomes more autonomous?
It certainly is a challenge, and it's one that will require constant vigilance and adaptation, but the SEP argues that it's essential for preserving human autonomy and ensuring that technology serves our best interests.
Okay, I'm following you. But let's be realistic for a moment. Even with all these safeguards in place, won't there still be times when things slip through the cracks? I mean, humans make mistakes, and I can't imagine AI will be perfect either.
You're absolutely right, and that's where the idea of moral crumple zones comes into play. The SEC uses this term to describe how individuals often become scapegoats for systemic failures, even when they had very little control over the outcome.
Right, I was thinking about this earlier with the Therac 25 and the Boeing 737 MAX crashes. It seems like the pilots or operators often take the fall, even if the root causes of the accidents were much deeper and more complex.
It's a real problem, and it highlights the need for a more nuanced understanding of responsibility in these situations. We can't just blindly apply our traditional legal and ethical frameworks to these new technological contexts.
So how do we avoid falling into that trap? How do we ensure that responsibility doesn't just get pinned on the most convenient target?
It's a tough question, and one that will require a lot of careful thought and consideration, but the SE suggests that we need to shift our focus from individual blame to a broader understanding of the socio-technical systems at play.
So it's about looking at the bigger picture, the interactions between humans, technology, and organizations, rather than just zeroing in on the one person who happened to be at the controls when something went wrong.
Precisely, it's about recognizing that responsibility is often distributed across a complex web of actors and systems, and that we need to develop new ways of thinking about accountability in this context.
This whole discussion is making me realize how much we take for granted when it comes to computers. We just assume they'll work as intended, and we don't always think about the ethical implications.
You've hit on a crucial point. As technology becomes more integrated into our lives, it's essential that we become more critical and aware of the moral dimensions of computing. It's not just a jive for philosophers and ethicists, it's a responsibility we all share.
You know, it's ironic we often think of technology as this neutral force, but the reality is that it's deeply intertwined with our values, our choices, our actions.
That's a really insightful observation. Technology is a mirror reflecting back our own ethical complexities.
Okay, this has been a seriously thought-provoking discussion.
Yeah.
I feel like we've only just scratched the surface of this whole computing and moral responsibility thing. What other key takeaways from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy should we be thinking about? So we've talked about the moral crumple zones idea, how individuals often take the blame for these big systemic failures, even when they might not have had that much control. And it makes me think about those tragic Boeing 737 AX crashes. Those pilots were put in incredibly tough situations, but in the end, they kind of became the face of the tragedy.
Yeah, it's a perfect example of how our existing frameworks for, thinking about responsibility can really struggle to keep up with the complexities of technology. We tend to want to find a single person to blame, but the reality is often much more complicated than that.
Yeah, it's like we're trying to fit a square peg into a round hole.
Hmm.
Our old ways of thinking just don't really apply anymore. So what can we do about it? How can we actually create systems that are more just and equitable when it comes to assigning responsibility for these technological failures?
Well, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy suggests that we need to move beyond this narrow focus on individual blame and start thinking more holistically about responsibility. It's about recognizing that responsibility can be shared and distributed across a network of people and systems.
So instead of just focusing on, say, the programmer who might have written a line of buggy code, we need to consider the role of the company, the regulatory agencies, the users, everyone involved in creating and using that technology.
Exactly. It's about acknowledging the interconnectedness of things and understanding that failures often arise from a combination of factors, not just the actions of a single individual.
But if responsibility is so spread out like that, how do we actually ensure that anyone is held accountable? It seems like it'd be easy for everyone to just point fingers and avoid taking ownership.
That's the challenge, and it's why fostering a culture of accountability is so crucial. It's about creating an environment where both individuals and organizations feel a real sense of ownership and responsibility for the technologies they create and use.
So it's not just about, following the rules, but about cultivating a deeper sense of ethical awareness, recognizing that our actions have consequences and that we have a duty to use technology responsibly.
Precisely. It's about moving beyond a purely legalistic framework and embracing a more proactive and ethical approach to how we develop and deploy technology.
This whole conversation has really opened my eyes to the ethical complexities of the digital world. It's so easy to get caught up in the excitement of new gadgets and innovations, but we can't forget about the human side of the equation.
I'm glad to hear that because at the end of the day, technology is a tool, and like any tool, it can be used for good or for bad.
It all comes down to the choices we make, the values we prioritize, and how we design and use these powerful technologies.
So, as you go about your day interacting with all this amazing technology, remember that you have a role to play in shaping its impact. Ask yourself, what are the ethical implications of this technology? Who's responsible for its consequences? And how can I use my voice and actions to ensure that technology serves humanity rather than the other way around?
Wow, those are some really powerful questions to ponder. I think we've given our listeners a lot to think about today.
I agree. This has been a fascinating deep dive into the intersection of computing and moral responsibility.
We've explored some really challenging concepts, but hopefully we've sparked some new insights and encouraged our listeners to engage more thoughtfully with the ethical dimensions of technology.
And on that note, I think it's time for us to wrap up this episode. We've covered a lot of ground, but this is really just the beginning of the conversation.
So to all our listeners out there, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep pushing the boundaries of your understanding.
Because as technology continues to evolve, so too must our ethical frameworks and our understanding of what it means to be human in this digital age.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time for another fascinating exploration of the ideas that are shaping our world.
Until then, stay curious.